Hello and welcome to the King Cole YouTube channel. Today we're going to look at knitting needle sizes in relation to the yarn that you're using. That's the yarn thickness. As with everything, this isn't set in stone. These are general guidelines and principles that are quite often useful to stick to. But when you're being creative, do whatever you feel like doing, use whatever size needles you like with your yarn. But we'll have a look at the basics to start with. Okay, so let's start looking first of all at 4-ply. Now with a 4-ply, generally you would work on a 3.25mm needle. So again, that's not set in stone, but that is a good rule of thumb. You can use slightly finer if you would wish, so you could go down to a 2.75. That would work with this yarn, it would make a firmer fabric, and if you went up to a 4mm, that would make a looser fabric for these. Now, I'll just move those across because I want to show you a second one, which is sock wool. So this is our particular sock wool. And with this, I'm going to show you the two different sizes of sock needles. There are lots more finer ones. You go down to probably 2mm thick, which is incredibly fine. It's like knitting with cocktail sticks. So that's a sock wool. These are your 4 double pins that are regularly recommended on patterns. This is for knitting socks in the round. Again, it's personal choice. If you like your socks a little bit firmer, go for a finer one. Go even right down to a 2mm if you wish. A lot of people knit on 3s, but it's very much a personal preference. Right, now we're going to look at some alpaca in DK, which is a real favourite of mine. Again, if you were knitting with this, generally you would go for a 4mm with your usual knitting, the main bulk of the knitting. You would also use 3.25s regularly with this. So if you were knitting a standard jumper, you'd start your ribbing on your 3.25s and you would do the main part on the 4mm. If you were wanting to knit in the round, say you wanted to knit a sleeve and you wanted it in the round, there's nothing stopping you using 3.25mm for the cuff and 4 for the bulk in double pointed needles. There's also different lengths of these. I think the shortest I've seen is a 10cm. 20cm are usually a fairly useful length, so if you haven't got any others, 20cm is a fairly useful one to start with. So that's for a DK yarn, and those are the needles. So the finer one for the ribbing and the 4mm slightly thicker for the bulk of it. Okay. This one I'm bringing in because this is one of our fancy yarns, and this is just to give you an idea of a slight difference. With this, you're knitting, we do have a one on our YouTube channel for jelly bean, but you're knitting with the finer piece of yarn in the middle. So I regularly like to use the 3.25mm if I want to get 2 stitches out of this. You can also use a 4mm for that. A little bit of personal preference going on here, but for that knitting 2 stitches with that tiny bit there, I like the 3.25s. Looking at that, if you didn't know what it was, you would expect to use really thick needles. So that's just to give you an idea of something slightly different. So next we're going to go with Aran. So this is our fashion Aran, which is a real good seller from our point of view and a really nice yarn to use. This works with the standard 5mm needle for the bulk of the knitting. You may use, and often do use, a 4 or even a 4.5 for the ribs around the bottom, but then move on to the 5s for the bulk of the knitting. That gives a nice, sensible, firm but not too firm fabric for you to work with on that one. Aran is pretty standard the world over in that you do use the 5mm to knit with. Okay. I'm going to show you two of our chunky yarns. Now, I say chunky, Opium doesn't have an exact weight given to it because, as you can see here, there's some very thin and some very thick ones. Some of our patterns use 4mm needles for part of it. Again, it could be probably for the ribbons and the edges. Most of the time you would knit the Opium somewhere between a 4, possibly a 5mm or a 6mm for that one. So that's a little bit different to your standard ones. We kind of group it with our chunky yarns, but it's not an exact tension, as a lot of our chunkies are a very standard tension. I'm just going to show you the separate chunky because I wouldn't use 4mm with that. I would use 5mm chunky for the ribbon, and I would use the 6mm chunky to go with the chunky for the bulk of the knitting. So usually, rule of thumb is about one size down for the ribs as per the main part. Okay. Next we're going to look at a super chunky. So this one is thicker. I'll just show you against a chunky. You can see there's quite a difference in the thickness, but with the super chunky, generally they're knit on 10mm needles and either an 8 or a 9mm for the ribbons. I'll also show you, because chunky can quite often get very big. If you were wanting to make a blanket and use a super chunky, then you'd probably be best going with a circular needle. That's not because you're going to knit in the round, but you would need it to get the number of stitches on. So bear that in mind, that if you're knitting something and you're struggling to get your stitches to stay on the needle because there's so many of them, go for a circular needle, knit backwards and forwards just in the same way. Always a useful one to know. Circular needles come in really fine sizes right up to 20-25mm. So look around, ask, see what there is, depending on what you're knitting with. There's a huge range of these. They also come in different lengths, which is measured in centimetres. So your 10mm is your thickness here, and then the 80cm is the length of the needle when stretched out. They start around a 40cm. You can get smaller ones, you can get ones for knitting socks on, but these general ones, they start around 40cm and go up to maybe 120, possibly 150. But again, shop around and see what you can find on that one, depending on what you need it for. And finally, I'm going to look at a really big one. This is our Big Value Big, and as you can see, it's about as thick as my little finger. So this is often knit on really, really big needles. So these are some of the thicker ones in our range. As you can see, we've got 30 and 35cm ones, so there's different lengths. 12mm might even be a little bit thin for some of these, but if you're using this say to make a cushion, you might want it to be a denser fabric, so you could use a 12mm. More likely to use a 15. And if you wanted something really loose and floppy like a throw, you might want to go up to a 20mm. Sorry, 20mm, not 20cm, on those. But you can see generally, the general rule of thumb is as the yarn gets thicker, so do the needles. That way you get a good tension and something that will work either to fit yourself or an accessory. Okay. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you next time. Please leave any feedback you have for us in the comments down below. Bye.